So good morning, everybody. A warm welcome to you all. We know it's a really busy period in the run up to the festive break, so it's really wonderful to see so many faces on the call. So thank you for joining us. This is a joint briefing event hosted by Centre for Mental Health and the Children and Young People's Mental Health Coalition to launch our latest report, Time for Action. The report examines spending across infant, children, young people's mental health services. For those who don't know me, I'm Kadra Abdinasser, Associate Director for Children and Young People's Mental Health at the Centre, and I'll be facilitating today's event. I'm joined by our Chief Economist, Nick O'Shea, who led on the report alongside my colleague Zoe. So just to briefly go over the format of the session, I'm going to help set the scene a little bit on why such a project was needed. Nick will share some findings from the report, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Charlotte Rayner, who will run us through a Q&A segment before Nick and I draw to a close. Before we kick off, I just wanted to remind you all of some digital housekeeping. I know we're all very familiar with that, but I have been asked to remind you all. So we will be recording today's event and posting it on Centre for Mental Health's YouTube channel following the event. Please do keep yourself on mute throughout the event to avoid distracting speakers or other delegates. There will be time for you to put questions to the speaker, so please feel free to use the chat function to drop any questions in. You can enable subtitles for the event by clicking the closed captions button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to tweet about the event using the hashtag Time for Action. And finally, a copy of the report will be shared in the chat and after the event via email. So just to set the scene a little bit and explain why we decided to carry out this piece of work and why now. We know that mental ill health amongst infants, children, and young people has been on the rise over the last couple of decades and has been rising even more sharply since 2017. 1 in 6 children and young people currently are estimated to be experiencing a mental health problem. Yet despite this rise, we still hear from many children and families that it's difficult to access support because of long waits, being told that they aren't ill enough, or that the support just isn't right for them. So while arguably there are historic levels of funding going into mental health services, we know we really started from a very low base. For a really long time, we also didn't have a true or complete understanding of mental health prevalence, and that really held us back in many ways. So our coalition members as well regularly tell us that funding is not enough for them, or it's not reaching the front line, because many of them are left managing ever-growing caseloads with the same level of funding they had about 10 years ago. So earlier this year, the coalition agreed to commission Centre for Mental Health to conduct a comprehensive economic assessment of the mental health system for all those aged 0 to 25. We're interested in understanding not only what's going on within the NHS and specialist services, but also community-based and public health services, the education system, and also across acute provision. We wanted to really establish where there were gaps in evidence and make some recommendations on investments aimed at government and at local commissioners. There are opportunities now and over the coming year to take action and really commit to sustainable funding through spending decisions off the back of the spending review that just took place a few months ago. We know there were things like the Better Start Fund, and we still want to ensure that the funding for things like the long-term plan continue. There's also the shift towards integrated care systems, which also present an opportunity for us. And next year, Department of Health and Social Care have committed to developing a new mental health plan, which also may present some opportunities. So thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Nick.
Thank you, Kadra, and thank you, everybody. And before I begin, may I thank Kadra again and Charlotte and Zoe for their expertise and I think patience with an economist, but jolly good stuff. Thank you all for coming today. Just by way of context, I've worked in this sector as a grown-up since about 1999, by which I mean the economic public policy sector rather than the CYP. So it's with that arc of sort of 22 years is how we'll be looking at this report today. So the 3 opening comments really. My economics teacher, Mr. Scally, who inspired me to become an economist, said, "Nicholas, your generation will be the first to have worse living standards than your parents." I thought, gosh, that's a bit tough, but actually he was right. And the reason I wanted to start with that is that actually it's quite difficult to discern that from looking at the outside world. And what has happened really over the last 50 years is that appearances have been deceptive. So we've gone really from society that saved, that had half-salary pensions, that owned stuff like cars, and then just over time, the implementation of credit and debt has come in, and now actually people don't own cars, they rent them, they rent houses rather than own them. Savings are very low, they've gone up because of the pandemic, but overall, you've gone from people having maybe £200,000 worth of savings equivalent today, just as a kind of average middle class saving, to £100,000 worth of debt. And the difference between those is obviously about £300,000. That's just an illustrative example. But I think in some ways that's almost what's happened here, is that actually we've gone from this system, which actually, you know, was 20 years ago pretty comprehensive and had a lot of strategic investment and had minimum standards, and then sort of really just drained it of that. But still the appearances and almost the memory of that system remain. And I think that's why when I looked at this subject, I'm surprised people aren't more annoyed actually about this, and they're not sort of far more protesting on the streets about where we are. So I just give you that comparison, is that I think looks can be deceptive. The second is around minimum standards. Now, government loves minimum standards because it gets us to do stuff. So minimum standards around, you must have your car MOT'd, water must meet a certain standard of food production. And I think going through this, that seemed to be the big gap, was if you are 6 and living in South London, what is the minimum expectation that you are going to get as a child and that those people around you are going to see happen? And how does that go from 0 to 25? And would that experience be the same as in Hull? Would that experience be the same as Plymouth? And whilst there have always been postcode lotteries, there's always been differences in money and per capita spending. Actually, the way in which things are being announced recently, where we'll have money for half the councils, money for this, money for that, a pilot scheme, but actually this isn't linking together into a minimum benchmarkable standard where you can say, yep, hands down, we know that these people are going to get that. And then finally, I think it is this idea though of a systemic response. And going back to sort of 2002, 2003, you did have that sense of the civil service and a government who were very much looking at the system in the round. So every child matters, and that was supposed to cover a very big wide age. And what happened is you then had components within those strategy that then made sure that you had a sense of, oh, okay, this is what's going to happen next. And I think with here, the reason we went with 0 to 25 was it was to try and re-establish that as a really strong concept, that from an economic perspective, but also from a social perspective, it's really important to see it as a sort of everybody working together around that child or around that group of children. Whilst it's very tempting for us to say, well, what about schools, or what about further education, or what about 5-year-olds? Actually, that sense of how we collaborate and the evidence that we bring together to do that is really key, because otherwise I think it's too easy to just say, oh great, I've got £500 million for this and £300 million for that and £400 million for that. But actually, does that work into a system, and does it lead to these minimum standards? One point I've got to say at the beginning, sorry, about my comparison with the macro situation is, I'm a school governor, been school governor for 22 long years. I've seen the amount of paperwork go up significantly, but it's been a very interesting experience. And just this idea though of appearances being deceptive is what I see with children. It's a primary school, but what I see with those children are just over time, the funding allocations haven't gone up with inflation, or they've gone down. More responsibility has been placed onto different people. It's all very innocuous at the time. Think, oh, okay, fine, we'll deal with that. But the result is now, is in 2021, we are in a situation, like I think most schools, where children with additional mental health needs present a financial problem to us, which is awful, because our job is to love that child and to give that child the best that we can do. But it is this sort of sense of, well, how have we got to here? So just as I think my friends around think, well, why don't I have a house? Why don't I own a car? Why don't I have what my parents have? It is that sense of, well, how have we got to here? Because there are lots of strategies, there are lots of commissions, there are lots of investigations, lots of research, and at the spending review, some nice advertising in terms of big ticket items for money being spent. But I think it's that sense of, somehow I think from an economic perspective, it's just not as good as it was, and I think it's not as good as it could be. And though while things are getting better and record amounts are being spent, yes, I think that was the sort of conclusion we came to. I think just going through the report quickly, I mean, what we have done is for sort of sheer reasons of simplicity, is to try and break it down into some fairly easy things to follow. So first of all, why invest in 0 to 25-year-olds? I mean, I'm not even going to go through that because it's very obvious, but needless to say, from an economic perspective, the earlier you invest, the greater the gain if you get it right. Zoe's chapter on, have things got better? Barack Obama, as we begin the chapter, said, there's never been a better time to be alive. And, the evidence is really mixed on that. And also, I think there's something about how people feel as well as what are the external factors around them. And I think the conclusion I drew from this chapter is that we've got to start measuring different things. So how do we look at things like the impact of social media? How do we look at the impact of always being on, your phone's always on? How do we look at these things? Because actually, I think they are becoming as important as what kind of house you live, what your parents do for a living, and all these other societal factors which have sort of, they tell us, I think, what to expect. 0 to 5 years, loads has been said on this age group. And, again, I remember things like Sure Start and the billions that were correctly poured into that. And again, it is this sense of, are we better off for this group? We know the number of health visitors has fallen by, I think, 20%. We know people are burnt out. We know that it's very, very variable depending on where you are. So, minimum standards, how are we measuring it? Are we better off? 5 to 16. Now, this is my choice here. I'm a huge fan of the national curriculum in that it gives everybody a sort of solid, this is what roughly this group of people should be doing. And after 16, we're all doing different things. People go into apprenticeships, the army, sixth form, so on. And it's the thing I wanted to convey with this chapter was the reason school is important as one aspect of the system is it is a moment where you, unlike any other time in your life, actually everybody at your age is pretty much in the same place at the same time. And therefore, to me, it seems like a very good place to be continuing that intervention that you've hopefully begun between 0 and 5 to really, but it's the standardization of, those people are there. You can really do something with them. 16 to 25-year-olds, I really worry. I think the disparity that I now see in comparison to, say, 30 years ago is extraordinary. I think you see that in terms of obviously careers and educational achievement, but it's kind of, on the one hand, you have gleaming children who've, got straight A's and off to live their best lives. And then I really worry about the high percentage of children who leave with no qualifications, no job. They may be in a nominal college place, but actually what's that doing to their mental health? And I think, but this is where the diffusion of people having very different lives between 16 and 25 comes in. And so a part of a system that you would need to absolutely respond to that and to say, right, okay, what are the main pathways and how do we find these people? I think this is the key element for any system is how do you find people in need when there's no obvious base where they all are going to be? And I know for our forecasting work around mental health demand services coming up as a result of the pandemic, that's been a key question for us is, yes, we can predict it's 8 million people and over 5 years, and it's going to roughly look like this. But how are you as a system going to identify those people? It's A&E, it's police, it's schools. But how do you get those systems to listen? And I think that's really important for the 16 to 25-year-olds. We then move on to hubs. Hubs seems to be the key word. I saw my department of work describes an economic hub recently, which I smiled about. But I mean, the point here is that what you've got is an opportunity to bring everything together and to really do some core work. It's like an egg. You've got the yolk where you do some great core work with some really intensively with young people. And then you've got the white, the albumin, which is the other people whose lives you also impact by being in the community. It is really important that local areas have the ability to make them locally relevant. Each place will be different. There's rurality, so on. But also what's really important is there's this minimum standard and funding. So it is no good to just fund some. It's about how do we get national coverage, and then how does that national coverage slot in to a wider system. And then finally, Bringingkevico, simple really. Some great work has been done around helping to get children and young people who are in acute beds out of area, miles away from home, back into the local area, in community settings where it's appropriate. the clinical outcomes are the primary thing. I have to say that it saves lots of money. That's great, but that is very much secondary to clinical outcomes. And I think the thing that's always stayed with me when I was interviewing those doctors and physicians was the level of professional stress they faced doing something different, by saying, actually, we're going to take a chance here, and we're going to, this person's been in this bed for 2 years, and we could probably just stay there for a while, really, it's fine. But actually, we're going to take a risk, we're going to bring them back, we're going to put something else in the community. And just, it was palpable, actually, how these very experienced professionals really felt it. And there's something for me, again, about how do we have a system which says, we're at A, we need to get to B. That requires a journey which has risk involved in it. You're the person carrying that risk. How do we support you, and how do we model good behavior in terms of letting people take what are called, safe risks? So that's it, really. I mean, finally, just to say, we need an outcomes framework, and I think that's going to go on my gravestone. So I want to please measure outcomes, but it's this idea of, if you don't measure it, you can't work out whether it's any good or not, and you will never really know if you're getting value for money. And that is whether you are buying a carton of milk, or you are trying to work out whether an intervention for a young person is working or not. And there's some brilliant work by Scotland, which I think just took it all, put it into a framework and made it wonderful. And I really would recommend you have a look at that. It's about 10 years old. It's just phenomenal. So really, I'll just conclude with my concluding remarks, really, which are in the report, is just to say, look, life isn't fair. It's not fair. People are born into very different households with very different chances and very different trajectories. I was super lucky. I grew up in a bubble called the O'Shea family, and I thank my parents frequently, and children in my class didn't. And we have very, very different lives now. And the job of government, in my view, is to give everyone a chance to live their best lives. And it is to put in place things that actually will help those children who do not have those advantages to get somewhere and to have their best shot. And for that to happen, I think there's 5 points, which is, your strategy has to outline the problem, research what to do about it, agree what you're going to do, and then fund it. And it's that last bit is the bit that I think hasn't happened. It's only happened by piecemeal. And until I think as a sector we get together and do that, we're not going to see much improvement. So that is what I wanted to say, Kadra.
Thank you so much, Nick. Okay, that was, a lot of really useful insights there. I'm now going to hand over to Charlotte, who will talk us through the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Kadra and Nick, and thank you everyone for attending. If you have got any questions throughout this Q&A session, then please do pop them in the chat. We have had a few come through already, which is really great. I just want to kick off, if that's okay, asking a question. So one of the main recommendations from the report is for a national investment strategy for 0 to 25-year-olds. But we know that money is being committed to children's mental health services through the NHS long-term plan and other previous strategies. So the NHS long-term plan pledges that spending on children's mental health services will grow at a faster rate than any other part of the NHS. Why do you think a national investment strategy is now so important? And how can we make sure that it links with previous commitments made in things like Future in Mind, NHS long-term plan, and that those commitments are delivered on? And Kadra and Nick, I'll start with you, Kadra, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. I guess for me, I think learning from previous policy initiatives such as the Excellent Future in Mind, which was published in 2015, that was a very comprehensive consultation exercise that was taken to develop that policy. I think the principles outlined in it and the ambitions were, very spot on, but I feel in many ways it was slightly undermined because of the lack of a cross-government investment strategy. A lot of the funding was rightly used to expand specialist services, but I think we really missed the trick to really plan together with local government, education, and other key agencies to really look at ways of streamlining and coordinating provision, because there were those shared aims outlined in the document, but not everybody had the resources to fulfill it. So I think for me, we are really dealing with the consequences of this now. And this report really is calling for a concerted focus on this moving forward, so we can learn those lessons and think about how better to coordinate together.
Brilliant, thank you, Kadra. And Nick, why do you think a national investment strategy is so important, having done this research?
Well, it's all about the money, really, isn't it? I mean, that's the bottom line. And I think what I would say is someone coming to this with, you know, as I mentioned before, limited field subject area knowledge, it's bewildering. I mean, I don't know how you guys keep track of it. I mean, there's, you know, so many different reports, and I think ultimately it just comes down to, you know, someone who loves you, somewhere safe to live, and a purpose in life. That's pretty much what we're all after, whether we're a child or an adult. But until you actually have a strategy that says, this is what I'm going to spend and this is what I'm going to get for it, it is only ever going to be piecemeal. And I think there's just something about, you know, challenging governments of whatever persuasion to say, do you really want to do this? Or are you just giving me some money to go away? And I think it's that sense of, if you look at the actions, you know, there is a point in any relationship, in any job, in any choice, where you have to commit, and you're either in or you're out. And I think an investment fund strategy is what's needed to show that commitment, because otherwise you're basically just saying, oh, have some money. You know, I mean, is it 57 billion, I think, was spent on track and trace, billion, you know, 57 billion pounds. I mean, you know, there's massive amounts of money. And then, you know, you look at that in comparison to, you know, 300 million for whatever, and you think, well, hold on, that's not comprehensive. So in short, Charlotte, because now I'm just ranting, it's about following the money. That's the thing.
Thank you both. And before we go into questions, I've just got one more, just thinking again about the current policy context and what's going on in the mental health landscape at the moment, because we are seeing quite a lot of change, and we know the Department of Health and Social Care has committed to developing this new mental health plan, which we're going to be seeing hopefully at the start of next year. How can we ensure that the recommendations of this national investment strategy is linked to this plan, so that the plan is actually backed up by an investment plan to go alongside it?
I guess for me, we'll definitely be sharing our report and findings with the department. And as part of the project, we also looked at many models of practice to help inform the report. Some of them are cited in the report, and we would really encourage officials to meet and hear directly from practitioners and the young people and families that they work with. I think, you know, really, we understand that we are in difficult economic circumstances with COVID. But I think it's, you know, all of us collectively making the case that investing in mental health is vital. It's part of the recovery agenda. It's part of leveling up. All of these aims that the government is, you know, currently pursuing. We need to, you know, continue to bang the drum, really, that mental health is a vital part of it. It's part of our overall physical health. And we have seen the effects, you know, the pandemic has taken on the nation's well-being. So yeah, I would encourage as many of us as possible to sort of participate in, you know, the forthcoming consultation process that will be happening next year.
Thank you, Kadra. Nick, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think there's two things. One is, I mean, I'm not here to be popular, I'm here to be honest. I think the sector could do with boosting its economic data, if I'm honest, and I think how I'm putting that together as a system rather than lots of different sort of interested parties. I think that would be a massive help, especially for, you know, ministers and civil servants who are just trying to understand how it all fits together and maybe aren't familiar. And then the second point really is that, you know, I think a lot of ministers and senior civil servants, you know, who are sort of my age and older, you know, actually I was never asked about my mental health at school, you know, ever. And actually there's a piece there, I think, about communicating why it is so important around children and young people from first principles, actually, because I think people think, oh well, I just got on with it, life was tough, you know, and it's a very different world now. And I think that communication would really help to then unlock some wallets.
Brilliant, thank you both. So the questions through the chat are coming in thick and fast, so I'll try my best to get through them in the time that we've got. So Nick, we've got a question for you from Gemma Isaac, and she says, do you think the demise of services like connections and other services which may have covered that 16 to 25 year age group has impacted? Gemma was a previous connections advisor, and they had hubs where young people could drop in, get support and receive that wraparound support. So how much do you think that has impacted?
I think there's two things. I think one is that undoubtedly, if you remove these services are there for people who are either struggling because that something's happened, or that they've got health problems, but also they're there for children who actually there is no other support network. So these are children who don't have responsible adults particularly around them, and so on. And I think therefore, yes, if you absolutely remove that infrastructure at whatever age, you're then going to see the problems happen. And I think one of the things that was really great about Sure Start was this sort of commitment. I know that's at the other end of the spectrum, but that was this commitment to having professionals that would be around the child, and then that would give them the start that then followed through to later in life. But I think there's another economic thing. So yes, there is a gap, is the answer to that question. There's another thing, which is the economics of the situation, which is now a lot of lone parents work very long hours. So that they're person serving you in Tesco Express at 10 p.m. at night, and their child is alone in the evening. And there's something about, as an economy, how are we responsible in enabling parents to actually be with their children? Because particularly as well, if you have two-parent households where actually everyone's at work all the time, how's that working out for you? And I think there's something really about here how we're all told that things are getting better. In that case, then economically, why don't people have much time to spend with their children?
Thank you. And we've had another question as well around so for example, children, young people with learning disabilities, automatically their life chances might be segregated. So how do we make sure that this messaging in this report is understood for all children and young people, including those with learning disabilities? Yes, it is inclusive of everyone.
Yeah, sure, of course, thanks. Absolutely. I think this is where the point about taking a cross-government approach comes into play here. Children and families are not living their lives in silos, and so it's really thinking about those groups of young people who may have coexisting needs, whether that's learning disability or mental health, making sure that the systems are as well integrated, and importantly that they center the voices of those young people, because I think we often create initiatives and solutions that particularly young people with learning disabilities, as our previous research collaboratively showed, Christine, is that they are often ignored and sort of overlooked, and the planning for their support is really continues to be pursued in a very siloed way. And so I think, yeah, just that taking that holistic cross-government approach hopefully will benefit many young people who face a range of different inequalities.
And just on the learning, I mean, I've volunteered with Lewisham Mencap in South London for 20 years, and I think we do seem to have gone backwards in the last 10 years, I would say. But I think the school age up to sort of 18 seems to be not awful. It's the transition between 18 to 25 where it all just seems to go catastrophically wrong, and people just, there is nothing. They literally go from quite a good thing to just nothing. And there is we're constantly trying to challenge at a local level and say, do you know where people are? Do you know what they're doing? And actually, why aren't people getting jobs? And the impact that can have on your mental health. So yes, it's a very valid point, and also physical disabilities as well.
Brilliant, thank you both. Another question that's come up in the chat is around school. So the report obviously focuses a lot on school as being a universal system where young people can access support. But someone's highlighted around the use of the increase in persistent absenteeism from school. So we know where children can't attend school. So if the presumption that all children being in school is the best way to support them, what about those children that can't access school for whatever reason it is? How do we make sure that they are supported and they get the mental health support that they need?
Thanks, Charlotte. I'm guessing that might have come from Ellie. Really great question. Thank you. I think for me, there's a huge sort of spotlight on persistent absenteeism at the moment, and it's a very sort of polarizing debate in the context of COVID. But I think this was a problem even before the pandemic. I think, really we need to think about how we best identify those children, young people who are falling out of contact with the education system. We need to understand why they are doing so. And, in the long term, the ambition really should be that we work towards developing a very inclusive education system that can respond and identify their needs appropriately. But also we know that there is a focus on delivering support through schools at the moment through mental health support teams. We really need to look at like how those teams support families and young people, both within the system, but also those who might be home educated, for example, in alternative provision. I think, you know, the message really from us is that all young people need to be in education. It doesn't mean that they are all physically in a, you know, mainstream educational setting. So we would really like to see that provision be expanded to those who might be in special schools, APs, home educated, and through other settings. And in the longer term, you know, thinking about what does educational recovery look like, and how can we create a more inclusive system for young people who have all sorts of differences so that they can continue to engage in their learning.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kadra. Yeah, that was a real key message from our members report earlier on in the year about having that more flexible and inclusive approach to education. Thank you so much. Another question that we've had relates to one of the other big changes that we're going to be seeing in the health landscape is around integrated care systems. So how can we use the development of integrated care systems as a pathway for change in ensuring that investment is made into children's mental health? I'll open it up to Kadra and Nick.
I mean, just from an economic perspective then, because Kadra's the expert here, but from an economic perspective, you've got to make the risks and the rewards clear. So however you structure something, who's buying it, who's getting it, who's measuring whether it's successful or not, and who's responsible for it at the end. And, you know, I'm pro anything that integrates funding and pro anything that gets leadership to happen. I think there's a lot of interesting work around the leadership of those things. But actually, if you're then funding some other stuff over here and some other stuff over there, is it a truly integrated care system? So I think my perception of what a system is maybe is a bit different than others, but it's that sense of, you know, who's got the money, what are they doing with it, and who's ultimately responsible.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, and I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on integrated care systems because they are a minefield to really understand, and that's part of the challenge really for us as a sector to advocate for children's mental health to form, you know, key elements within the planning of all these changes, structural changes that are going across the system. But I think it does really present us with, well, yeah, thank you, Andy. Please share with any ICS leaders in your area our report. That would be great. But I think really, you know, it does present us an opportunity to think about that joined up planning and approach that can be taken across local authorities, the NHS, the education system. As we, you know, morph into these ICSs, I think the challenge will be really thinking about who holds that responsibility around young people's mental health, and, you know, working to sort of like lobby them on the local level, on the national level, sharing that insight, ensuring that mental health providers, education providers have a seat at the table. And that's something, again, going back to things like Future in Mind, that we can really learn from how they work together as a system around the local transformation plans. So, and we are actually hosting a joint webinar the end of January, looking at how we can make integrated care systems work for children and young people's mental health. So we'll be sure to share a link in the chat later.
Thank you so much, Kadra and Nick. And yes, please do share this report with ICSs in your local area. I mean, thinking about another part of the system, we know that the voluntary and community sector plays such a big role in the children's mental health space, and is so important. And I think we've seen that now more than ever during the COVID pandemic. How can we make sure that the voluntary sector best fit into this comprehensive system?
Just from this is not speaking as an economist, but just from experience of being in the civil service, it's relationships. And I think what you've got to do is just get those relationships, whether it's local, regional, or national, really right, because I think people do business, so to speak, with people that they know and trust. And I think it's very difficult where, for example, you know, if you've got lots of, if it's all about local, then as a national VCS organisation, how on earth do you do that? And then the reverse is also true. If it's all national, how does Lewisham Mencap get involved? But it is really just finding those key people. And I think that's both cross VCS and then up and down with the others, because yeah, I've just seen it so many times. People just call up the people they know, and then that's how they get things done.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that, you know, one of the areas that frustrates me the most is just the lack of like integration of data and outcomes on, especially. I think many areas, they actually make themselves look a lot worse than they are when they sort of report on things like CAMS waiting times, because actually, you know, the NHS provider may have, you know, commissioned a voluntary sector agency to support young people in the area, and actually they are receiving support while they are waiting for the CAMS appointment, but that data is not, you know, it doesn't feed into the system because it's, you know, it's a system designed for statutory bodies. I think what would be helpful, and it is starting to happen in some areas, is getting that flow of data from the voluntary and community sector on performance and on outcomes integrated, so that we have you know, a more complete picture of what is happening across the system. And that will help us, I think, over time, really recognize the value that the important work that the voluntary and community sector do in this space. They are a huge provider, but sadly, they aren't recognized in the same way.
Thank you both. I'm just cautious of time. So any questions that we haven't had chance to answer today in the webinar, I'm really sorry, we'll take these away and we'll send you, we'll make sure that these get answered. But I just wanted to finish on one final question. If there's one key message or action that you'd like attendees to take away from the event today, what would that be? And I'll put that to both of you.
Shall I go, Kadra? Go on. Because yours will be better than mine. I've got three actually. One is be ready to cost what national delivery of your thing would be. So if you work in that sector, you know how much national minimum delivery would be. Secondly, I challenge you to go and find the Social Exclusion Task Force archive website, which has tons of stuff, which really just says, look, we know very well what to do. Here's all the evidence. This is how much it costs, and go for it, because I think it's just not used enough and would save us about 10 years of rehashing it. But I suppose if I could only have one thing, I would just say to you, the next time you're talking about your service or your program or your area of interest, please either begin or end your sentence with, as part of an integrated 0 to 25 system. And I think just situating your service within that wider system and getting that to be a thing would be a really good move.
Thank you, Nick. Kadra?
Thanks. I think a key message for me is that we just really continue to advocate and champion a whole system approach to infant, children, young people's mental health. I think the pandemic has really shown us what is possible when we come together as a system to respond. And I really think, you know, it's on all of us to really identify and share what lessons we can take forward to really strengthen that message. Yeah, and I guess another thing for me is, you know, how can we ensure, as you know, we continue to advocate also for parity of esteem between physical and mental health, that this also extends to investment, because we're not seeing that at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. Thank you everyone for your questions, and we'll take the ones that haven't been answered, we will take those away. But I'll now hand back over to Kadra and Nick to share some closing thoughts.
So I couldn't remember which way around it was, Kadra. Is that right? Yeah, look, I mean, just to say, I mean, I think there is hope. I think the pandemic has really offered an opportunity to do things differently, to show what can be achieved in a very quick space of time. I think there's lots of people who really care about this area. There's lots of evidence about what to do. And so really now it's just about bringing that together for kind of a push, really. But I think it is this thing of judge by the actions. Don't be satisfied with pilots or pockets of funding or one-offs, and know that you're dealing with an administration that has got fiscal constraints. They're not going to want to invest in stuff that they're still having to pay for in 10 years' time. But actually, I don't think you're ever going to get a better moment than this, really, in terms of people really watching this, especially in response to the pandemic. So yeah, I think it's just go for it as part of a systemic response.
I think for me, just sort of final reflections is, you know, we desperately need greater transparency when it comes to spending across children, young people's mental health. And that's really what led us to, you know, this was our first attempt at doing that, but there's still so much more evidence out there that we've not been, able to access. So we do hope, in the future, we can work towards developing a centralized system to track spending across the children's mental health system, including within the voluntary and community sector. So I think we'll leave it there as we've now reached the end of the session. So thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I hope you enjoyed it. And on behalf of the Centre and the Coalition, we wish you all a wonderful festive season and look forward to seeing you at one of our future events. Thank you, everybody.